Hello, I'm Francis Seeley from GlobalNet 21, and I'd like to welcome you to this webinar today. We do many webinars and interviews over a period of time, and in this particular webinar, we're going to look at faith in the community. And to help us with that, we have Rob Wickham, who is the Bishop of Edmonton, and I think he's been the Bishop since 2015. Now, he looks at how he can witness his faith in the community, how we can look at the problems of the 21st century, the problems we face today, and how the church should adjust itself to work with that community in a form of partnership. He's been influenced by many, many thinkers. He had a lot of experience in the northeast of England, in Somerstown, in Camden, and also in Hackney, which has influenced him a great deal in the way he applies his faith to the community. And of course, in 2011, we had the riots, which really challenged us all and took us all by surprise. And the church particularly had to adjust how it was going to approach this particular problem. And we're going to talk to Rob about that as well, in the way that they confronted this issue and tried to bring people together. And of course, today we have a new crisis, the coronavirus, and the church is now looking, like many other organizations, on how they can help people. People are lonely, people are vulnerable, people are elderly, and so on, who are going to be at risk, and how they can do that in partnership with others. Anyhow, let's start this video soon, but let me say first that we're doing this with Emma Rigby. Emma is someone who herself has been involved in creating some sort of voluntary infrastructure around helping people who are in fear or affected by the coronavirus. So she's the ideal person to have doing this webinar with us. So let's go straight into this webinar and look at how Rob Wickham adjusts his faith to the everyday needs of our modern society. We first ask him, though, what it was that led him to be in the clergy, why he chose that. It's his vocation in his life.
I started going to church when I was 8 years old, and I've never been to a Sunday school in my life. I was never taken by my parents when I was small, because I said to my parents I wanted to join a choir. So they said, "Well, join the local church then." So I joined the local church to sing in the choir, and that kept me ticking over for a few years. And it's only when I was about 15, 16, I thought, perhaps I need to understand a little bit more about what this is all about. And I also had the beginnings of a sort of thinking, I could do that job that the vicar's doing in this particular church. This is in Surrey, where I grew up. And on the back of that, the vicar very, very kindly said to me, stick all that stuff on back burner, get on with your school life, get on with your friends. And we, excuse me, we took it from there. And so it was when I was at university. I studied geography at university, which was great fun. And it was when I was at university that I went through the formal process of discernment and seeing whether it was right for me to be ordained. And so I went through a national panel, as all clergy have to do, in order to discern whether it was the right thing to do. And the panel came back and said, yes, we think that you should be ordained. I grew up in Surrey. I then I had a year out and worked in Harrods for a while, which is quite an interesting place to be. I was then a care assistant for a guy with cerebral palsy for a year or so, and then went to university. I then spent a fabulous year, which was one of those life-changing years, which was in a place called Wallsend, just on Tyneside. I worked for a church there, St Luke's Church. At the same time, the Swan Hunter shipyard closed down, so it was extraordinary urban deprivation. I also worked on an estate where the nearby streets to the church-based drop-in centre where I was based, called the Cedarwood Centre, had something in the region of 80% unemployment, male unemployment. So 4 out of every 5 men were unemployed. And I don't think I've ever lived in an area of deprivation like it.
Let's take that step by step, because we'll talk about the development in Somerstown and Hackney as well, because those had really big influences on you. We've got Emma Rigby with us as well, who's going to help with the interviewing. I think people saw a shot of her just now. So Emma, let's go over to you.
So growing up, what did you want to be, Bishop Rob? I know you spoke about being in the choir and getting to the age of 16, but when you were a small boy, what did you want to be?
Well, for a while, I wanted to be a vet. For another while, I wanted to be, now my very first recollection of what I wanted to be, it was going to be a singing fireman. And it had to be a singing fireman. I remember that. Then I remember thinking about becoming a teacher. And those were the things which I thought about before being ordained. And it was a very short while where I thought about becoming a lawyer as well. But yeah, the teacher was the other one.
Hackney. I mean, you and I have discussed Hackney before, and you were down there when the London riots hit. But did your experiences in Hackney, do you think they shaped your view of what the church should be and how it should witness to the community?
Yeah, I had 9 fabulous years in Hackney. I must confess, I think in all sorts of ways, they were fabulous years. They were also really challenging years. And they were challenging because I had this extraordinary building set in a whopping great big churchyard. So it was 2.5 hectares of churchyard, which is one of the biggest green spaces that there is in Hackney. And this church building that could seat 2,200 people.
Wow.
It was a vast, vast building. And when I got there, there were all sorts of plans in place to turn the church building into a much smaller, excuse me. I went for a run this morning. That's why I'm coughing. It's no other reason.
It's all right. We don't mind if you cough. It's fine.
Excellent. You kind of worry every time you're coughing. It's making
You
sure
do, don't you?
at the moment. And so every time it rained, the buckets came out in this church building, and there was a congregation of about sort of 50, 60 people associated with it, rattling around in this big building. And there was an arts project related to reaching out to the homeless that was there as well. And it felt as if it was quite tired, and the plans in place were to build some accommodation inside the building, to build a much smaller worship space inside the building, to be a place with halls and a cafe, and really exciting in terms of a sustainable model for how to keep a building ticking over. But there was no plans in place in terms of how do you develop something for growth? How do you grow a church in that part of the world? It was almost as if we were buying into the philosophy that sort of said actually organized religion is on its way out, and less people are going to church. Therefore, it's only a matter of time before it dies. And that is a very strong feeling for a lot of people. And so over the course of the 9 years, we spent a lot of time just focusing upon how do you grow a church, which was fabulous. But of course, it had to grow as it looked like Hackney as well. So, we we didn't want to bust lots of people in, but it's about how do you enable those in Hackney to have an encounter with Jesus. That was the key thing. But also, so we developed this thing called the St. John at Hackney project, which was a 5-year mission action plan, which set aside, we wanted to treble the size of the church over that time. We wanted to really focus upon older people and children and youth, and also telling the story of Hackney. That was one of the big things that we wanted to do. And through all that, we began a process of reordering the church building. We began a process of listening to what the local community was asking from their parish church. And over the course of those 9 years, we then went into something called the Oasis project after the 5 years, where it became really apparent we wanted to quadruple the size of the church again. Okay, so by the time I left, it was about 180 people on a Sunday morning. They now have 500 people on a Sunday morning.
Wow.
Because of this sort of sense of extraordinary growth. So actually, over the last 12, 13 years, the church has grown 10 times of what it was when I first started there. And I'm just really excited to see that taking place. There was something about play which we wanted to take seriously. So we brought in an artist in residence who was brilliant, and he did this lovely thing called Romp and Roll, about focusing upon mums and carers and dads and children. But there was no play apparatus. Now, I've been to so many parent and toddler groups where the parents sit at one end with their cups of coffee and the toddlers at another end playing with all the stuff. Now, there's none of that. It was all about interactive play, because we recognised that was something which actually parents struggle with. How do you play well with your children. So we did a bit of that. We began a night shelter. We began a food bank. We had some debt advice that we operated from the building. We turned the building also into a concert venue. So we had people like Coldplay and
Wow.
Gary Barlow and Elbow and Emily Sandé, and all these sort of extraordinary names came to play in the church building as well. And so it was just this sort of wonderful roller coaster ride at one level in terms of just trying to fill the building with as much life as you could. And it was wonderful to see church really grow as a result of all that.
So,
yeah.
I mean, obviously those influences were great on you, working in Hackney, getting people into the church, and then going out to the community and listening to them, finding out what they wanted is important. But you've had other influences in your life as well, haven't you? I mean, ones that you've learned about in the 19th century, Joshua Watson, for example, is someone that's influenced you, and the growth of education when he created the National Society. How important was that to you?
Oh, hugely. Gosh, you've been doing your homework, haven't you? I'm very impressed with this. Well done. Hugely important. So Joshua Watson's brother, John Watson, was the rector of Hackney for 40 years. So he effectively was my predecessor. And his predecessor, many, many years before, in 1520, Christopher Erswick, his name was, started the first school, and I was the vice chair of governors of the school there. So this year's the 500th anniversary of the school. It's now called the Erswick School. And Christopher Erswick was an extraordinary fellow. We think he was a spy in the Battle of Bosworth Field. He was also a royal matchmaker in order to marry off Henry VII. And he was Margaret Beaufort, Henry VIII's granny. He was Margaret Beaufort's priest confessor. So he retired, as you do, to Hackney and started the first school, which was, which was absolutely delightful. And so that influence of Christopher Erswick and the influence of Joshua Watson, the brother of John Watson, who built the church building that I was then renovating or doing the fundraising to renovate for, made me think, well, okay, what is the impact of education? So I did a master's degree at King's, which was in theology, politics and faith-based organisations. And my dissertation, now published in a book which is about Anglican schools for the future, that my dissertation was all about the political theology of Joshua Watson, and quite clearly he was the Bill Gates of his day. He made a lot of money in the wine trade. His dad was a principal wine merchant whose contracts were with government at the same time of the Napoleonic Wars, and you can kind of imagine these smoke-filled rooms where people are smoking their pipes and things, having a glass of whatever it is, making all these extraordinary decisions. And the wine was there, brought by Joshua Watson's dad. He was the dealer for it all. And so they made money in the wine trade, but he gave most of his money away. And he also helped, it was absolute revolution from 1811 up to 1855 when Joshua Watson died, up to 1840s really, when he was involved in the National Society. They founded something in the region of 17,000 schools, all of which were church schools. There was no such thing as a state school in those days. And the schools were absolutely places where, if you give a bit of education, the end result is you are less likely to have revolution. So one of the arguments is, why didn't we overthrow the government? Why didn't the people overthrow the government or overthrow royalty or these sorts of things? One of the arguments for that is that actually, unlike in France and unlike to some extent in America and unlike in Russia, education was the big difference in the UK. And this was an education focus which was developed by the church for everyone. So in the same way that church schools are open now to serve their wider communities, that was very much the case then. So I think he's the most extraordinary character.
So that brings me on to quite a controversial question now, actually. I want to know if you feel, and I'm sure that you do after your explanation, if his work's still important. But obviously some people feel very strongly that church schools have no place, are unfair and create divisions. So do church schools have a place in society in the 21st century? And that's a really silly question to ask a bishop, actually, because you know what he's going to say, Francis. But anyway, Bishop Rob, I'd love your feedback on that. Do they have a place in society in the 21st century?
Well, do you know what? Faith and people's belief in God is stronger now worldwide than any other point, certainly in the last 2,000 years where Christianity's been around. You know, people of faith, people are responding to God in extraordinary ways. Now, we don't see it as much in the West, in Western Europe, but quite recently I was out in Africa, out in Angola, and, you know, out in Luanda, you can see churches opening schools left, right and centre. You know, it's a real growth industry, not necessarily in this country, but beyond. And why do I think it's important? Well, you know, what's really important about church schools is they do talk about faith, and they give space for people to explore something of you know, their own sort of sense of desires, their own sense of calling, where God might be in the midst of all that. You know, and they also have plenty of opportunity to embrace the stories of the scriptures, the story of God's love affair with his creation in the Bible. And, you know, what we find through those schools is a real ability to embrace all sorts of things too, around culture, around music and around art, those things where faith has inspired, you know, the world effectively, to help us become fully flourishing as human beings. And that's what our church school's about. They're trying to create places where children can really understand themselves and to fully flourish as a result. And it's so narrow-minded to say that that voice needs to be removed from society, particularly at a time where religious literacy is so poor, you know, in terms of people's basic understanding of what different faiths teach. And, you know, they kind of lump all faiths together and say, well, that's the faith lot, and you need to keep it all to your, you know, to your private, you know, your private realm, what you do in your spare time and things like that, without recognizing that the majority of volunteers, vast numbers of volunteers, are people who are driven by faith, you know, by the fact that God tells them it's good to serve your sisters and brothers. And so, you know, there's something here for me, which is about saying that, you know, church schools are really good, because if Jesus came that children and adults would have life in all its fullness, then actually education is a key part of demonstrating that. And so therefore, I think there's an absolute place for faith schools. It's not just saying, oh, we've always been here, therefore we need to be here in the future. But actually, it's about creating identity. It's about creating places of belonging, places of forgiveness. It's about creating places of hope, but also where things go difficult. It's about recognizing that, you know, God's love is for all children. And you know, as I say, in a world where, or certainly in a UK where religious literacy is so poor, it would get worse, which would actually add to the problems of the world if you got rid of faith schools. So that's one of the reasons why I'm a big supporter.
Okay.
Thank you.
You have obviously talked about creating new ways of doing things, and that's really interesting. I mean, do you think that it's important for the church, and for all faiths, in fact, to recreate themselves now and then? John Wesley recreated the church in the 18th century. Do you have to do the same now?
Yeah, there's a lovely prayer, or a lovely promise which clergy make when they take over new roles. And that is that we say that we will proclaim the gospel afresh to each and every generation. That's the public pledge which clergy make. And I think it is really it's really important for us to yes, you know, we come from a history, we come from a past, but actually, you know, Christianity is lived out in the present. And, you know, we can't just sort of harker back to perhaps something that may have been some years ago or whatever. But there's a constant idea of sort of saying, how do we apply the teachings of Jesus Christ now to our current age? And therefore, how do we also plan something into the future for the way in which we need to be? So churches are evolving, churches are changing all the time. Being true to the scriptures, that's the key thing. Being true to the scriptures, being true to our sort of sense of history and understanding our sense of history. And there's a lovely Anglican kind of focus, which is about actually how do you create a dialogue between scripture, tradition, and reason. They're the three stools, they're the three legs of a stool. And it's trying to understand, you know, the interplay between scripture, tradition, and reason. And with those three together, I think you can really fathom something about what God is asking of us in the present age. As I say, having to proclaim the gospel afresh to each and every generation. So the digital world is a clear example of how churches are now embracing much more And with the virus that's going around, there's a really big push across the churches at the moment, which is about saying, how do we live stream services? So if people are self-isolating for whatever reason, then they can still access, they can still listen and still be part of the church services with streaming that's going on, or with online prayer that's going on, and so on and so forth. So we're constantly thinking, what are the best ways in which we can serve people, reach out to people, and tell people they're loved by Jesus Christ?
Became the Bishop of Edmonton in 2015. So how did you go about bringing your community engagement mission into the new diocesan you had landed in?
Okay, that's a lovely question. Thank you.
Thank you. I think I got it right. Can you edit that last bit out? I'm still getting over the coronavirus.
I almost certainly will.
Thank you. I'm self-isolating.
Well done. Well done. So you know all about live streaming and all that kind of stuff now, don't you?
Yeah.
So I'm a big fan of listening. That's what I do. I'm a big fan of listening, and so my first 9 months in post, I carried out a listening exercise where I listened to clergy. Excuse me. I listened to our lay people. I went to listen to business leaders. I listened to councillors. I listened to members of parliament. And my question throughout was, from where you sit, what do we look like? And it was fascinating hearing people's different responses about what they thought the church looked like across the 4 boroughs that I oversee. And so as the Bishop of Edmonton, I oversee the churches across Enfield and Barnet and Haringey and Camden. So the area stretches from Holborn out to the M25. It's like a big sort of piece of a cake that Greater London is. And it's serving 1.2 million people. It's now 1.3 million people in the Episcopal area. So it's a big, big patch. And one of the things that I loved about the listening exercise was it enabled us to really begin to focus about where we're going to put our energies. And so, really encouraging our churches, 120 churches I helped to oversee, and really encouraging our churches in terms of the work, particularly that we're doing in areas of deprivation, how we're reaching out to those who are poor, supporting the night shelters that are taking place as well, food banks I've been supporting, things like that as well. So trying to create a culture in the church which is about listening, which is of course hugely important, to listen to people's experiences and so on, but then also begin to really focus our energies in terms of serving our local communities, because that's what we're about. The Church of England at its heart is an organisation which seeks to serve its non-members. That's one of our DNA, part of our DNA. And so it's saying, how do we focus and support and love the communities that we're there to serve? And so that's, as I say, that's seen now in a number of projects which have taken place. More focus, we've opened a number of new churches in the time. So St Peter's Stonegrove up in Edgware has been opened in our time, brand new church and community centre. St Francis in the Engine Room in Tottenham Hale has been opened, again, church and nursery and community centre, all in one place. And so there's a number of church plants that we've opened as well, which is planting a group from one church, which is perhaps a larger church, into another place in order to serve that local community. So at the moment across the diocese, not just in my patch, but over the course of London, we're on course to have opened something in the region of 95 new churches over the course of the last 5-6 years. And so it's all about focusing upon growth, but this growth has to be about serving, not our needs, but serving the needs of the local community, which comes from listening.
Okay, so you've told us a lot about your what's influenced you and how you tried to recreate the church in the present context we find ourselves in. I know that the 2011 riots had a big effect on you. I mean, you had influence in Hackney and Somerstown, and then the riots came along. And I mean, did you find then that the focus was beginning to shift? You had to deal with alienation, you had to deal with poverty, you had to deal with knife crime. And is that something you began to focus on and try to galvanize your churches around servicing those problems?
Yes, I mean, several things in relation to that. So when I was the vicar of Somerstown, 7/7 happened. And so, King's Cross Station and was in the parish that I helped serve, and Camden Market and places. There were 4 churches. There were a number of us running 4 churches across that part of North London. And what became really clear was the way in which different communities responded to that sort of, very hugely uncomfortable international event that 7/7 was. And, clearly in the local community, people were deeply affected by that. But what you saw was, I was a board member of the local housing association as well at the time. And what you saw was a sort of sense of different communities responding in different ways. You had the Bengali community who sought solace and support in each other. You had very much the white working class community, which sought solace in nuclear family, and that was the place where you went to for your support. And other cultures doing kind of other things as well. And it just knocked home the fact that actually, pulling difference together is a really key part of the work of the church if we're to build strong community. And then in terms of when the riots happened in 2011, it was an extraordinary, the first brick in the Hackney was 2 days after the ones in Tottenham, and the first brick was thrown in my churchyard. I watched it happen, and and then to have a whole night really of civil unrest taking place, where it was a series of protesters and the police kind of battling against each other. It was extraordinary really, and watching attempted arson taking place, and lots of looting taking place as well. And again, it knocked, what you saw was a sense of civil society walking out that night and turning its back on an area of significant deprivation. And as a result of all that, I felt really strongly that the church needed to be part of the rebuilding of something significant. And so, the next day I was there on the town hall steps, and those who had turned up with their buckets and their rubber gloves to do the cleanup operation stuff. We addressed the crowd, and we got the crowd to go up to Clarence Road, where the majority of difficulty had taken place. To do a significant cleanup operation. That was sort of spearheaded really by St John's and by all those involved in Twitter, where the crowd sort of came out from. And then the church oversaw a prayer vigil the next day, which was again pulling the community together. And then 1 week after the riots, we then pulled together. We had a street party on Clarence Road, which was the road that was most affected. And it was an extraordinary 400 people now came along to it. And what was amazing about it was we really downplayed the press. This was for the local community to come to terms with the fact, particularly for children, that 1 week before the streets had become a kind of, place with petrol bombs being thrown. And in the street party, there were children sitting on the same streets, on the same pavements with chalk, and they were decorating, the floor and saying, we're kind of reclaiming really this street. And I think having done that, I believe passionately that clergy need to do legwork. That's one of the phrases that we use, which is about building community. And because we'd done that legwork in Hackney, it meant that local business owners could come and support. So the afternoon tea was sponsored effectively by Marks and Spencer's, because we knew who the manager was. We knew who the manager was of all the different shops and things like that. And so it was a real opportunity to actually pull in some of those contacts and pull in some of those relationships for the betterment of society. And that's, it's been one of those key moments that's just driven me in terms of how do we respond to some of the community issues. And you're right about, serious youth violence and how do we respond to serious youth violence. There's something, having seen civil society walk out, there's a driver within me that sort of says, actually, if churches can help to recognise the role of civil society or faithful capital, or social capital, depending on which terms we want to use, then so much the better, because there is something about collective responsibility for the building up of our communities. And that's the thing that drives me.
We've got Emma with us today, and Emma's been very much involved in the community safety issue, as you know. And we now have this crisis, a pandemic facing us, the coronavirus. And Emma again has stepped up and is doing a lot of work on that and is involving you in the churches as well. Now, is that something that you think is important for the churches to do, to look for people who are isolated, lonely, at risk, and see what you can do to help, but not on your own, in cooperation with other people?
Absolutely right. Partnerships is absolutely where it's at when these sorts of issues take place. And no one institution is well placed enough, I think, in order to respond to something like the virus as it spreads. And so I think for me, one of the directives, of course, that's gone out already to all of our churches, and there's more to follow this week. I can guarantee that. There's going to be a whole focus, I think, in terms of how do we energize and enable our churches. As most of our churches have all sorts of community work taking place in them already. Be it with night shelters and places for people to sleep, or the food banks, or afternoon teas, or for the elderly, or whatever it might be. So the outreach into our communities is vast, actually, for our churches, and yet we recognise we don't reach out into everyone. And so we are encouraging our churches now to enter or to develop the partnerships. They're all in partnerships with the local community already, but to develop those partnerships, particularly in being able to highlight where those who are vulnerable, those who are elderly, perhaps those who are self-isolating, in order to provide as much pastoral care and support as we possibly can. So absolutely, that's at the forefront of kind of my to-do list this week, actually. That's what it looks like.
You're also interested in active citizenship and have worked with Citizens UK, which I'm a huge fan of theirs as well. What does that mean to you? And I gather you're trying to develop this in Enfield. So I've been to some meetings myself. So tell us a little bit about Citizens UK.
So there's a wonderful person who's kind of not everyone's cup of tea, but Saul Alinsky is the chap's name. And Saul Alinsky wrote Rules for Radicals in the 1920s, 1930s, one of those two. He was based in Chicago. And Saul Alinsky recognised that those with money were exploiting those without money. And what he did was try to energise those without money. There's all sorts of examples relating to Chicago Airport and things like that about it all. And what he did was effectively try to organise those who were with no power to recognise the power that they had when they came together. That's what community organising is about. Mm-hmm. And it's trying to speak truth to power, but it's about listening exercise. It's listening to what's taking place on the ground level, not what's taking place in some report that's in some town hall somewhere or whatever. It's about taking real life examples, real life stories from people who are in the community, and organising around that. So trying to get large numbers of people to respond by using their voices and using their bodies in terms of being in a particular place for some sort of action or whatever it might be. But there's also, I love the sense of creativity about it. So when the Living Wage campaign, and I was a Living Wage commissioner for a wee while, when the Living Wage campaign sort of came in, there was a recognition that those who work in hotels were underpaid, weren't receiving the living wage. And therefore they were really struggling. And so, I wasn't part of the team, but for a lovely story of 4 people, one of whom was a priest, one of whom was a rabbi, one of whom was an imam, and one of whom was a nun. And the 4 of them, over 4 consecutive mornings, went into one of these central London hotels for breakfast. And during the breakfast, everyone was quite quiet and they were eating their food and that sort of stuff. One of them would stand up and say, "This is the rate of pay which people are receiving in this hotel. Please tip them generously because they can't afford to live in London on what they're being paid." That happened on 4 consecutive mornings. And you can imagine by the 5th morning, actually the manager was on the door, not allowing them to go in because they were causing disruption and they were speaking the truth. Mm. So the manager then had a conversation with these people, with the team, and it led to this particular hotel chain embracing the living wage for their staff. And so that sense of corporate work, kind of community organising, so with a particular aim in mind, and then being a bit disruptive in the process. And so I think that's one of the reasons why I'm a fan of community organising, just seeing, what can take place if you listen and then you take action. You don't just sort of think, oh, that they're there, that's it, it'll all get better. But you want to take decisive action as a result of all that. So I think in terms of particularly now, after all these years of austerity and within our wider communities, particularly with the cutbacks around youth work and children's provision and, you know, mental health services and so on and so forth. You know, there's something quite important about how do we respond as a community by actually drawing people together, by doing the listening exercises and then acting on what's been said, as opposed to, you know, it gives you traction from the local as well. So that's why I'm a big fan.
Okay, then we're getting very close to the end of the interview now, and so before Emma comes on and asks you how people can get in touch with you, etc., can I ask you this question? I mean, it's quite interesting what you said about the people who went into the hotel from different faiths. We talked about the 19th century when the big conflict was between nonconformism and Anglicanism. Today, we're in a situation where Christianity is no longer the only act in town. You know, we're in a multi-faith society and you have to work together. Now, how does your Christianity adapt to that situation? You can't be evangelical anymore when you have to live side by side with other religions.
That's a really, really interesting question. I think there's a lovely thing here of, there's a phrase which my clergy will be able to repeat back to you lots of times, I'm sure, which is called roots down, walls down. This was a phrase that was taught me when I was in Cambridge doing my theological studies. And, you know, roots down, walls down basically means that you can have a relationship with absolutely anyone if you are secure in your own walk with Jesus Christ. And therefore, I want to enable the church as best as we can to embrace all sorts of partnership and all sorts of ability to be able to affect change within our wider society and wider communities. And we do that by being authentically Christian. We don't water Christianity down. You know, we don't pretend it's something that it's not. You know, we're very clear about that. Just in terms of being rooted and being, you know, understanding who you are. But there's also something then of a power dynamic, which is one of sort of saying, actually, we need Christian leaders to be powerless and to be ones rooted in humility, which is about sort of saying, actually, you know, we don't try and heap up power for ourselves, but actually it's how do we work in partnership with others from the place of security that we're coming from. And so, you know, I actively want to support all sorts of opportunities around working with other faiths. I love the fact that our Muslim brothers and sisters, particularly when during the time of Ramadan, when there's the breaking of the fast, the iftar meals, I love the fact there's a much more openness now in terms of welcoming people to come to them and so on. So it's not just Christianity, which I think is roots down, walls down. We see it in some of the other faiths as well, about wanting to work in partnership for the betterment of society. But you know, I'm going to just go back a little bit, Francis, in terms of actually, I think we can be evangelical because yes, we live in a multi-faith society, but we also live in an extraordinary a society which tries to poo-poo the idea of religion or the idea of God being around and, you know, try and silence that voice. And so, I mean, I do think there's something inherent that you know, Christians, if they're rooted, they need to be able to confidently tell their story and account for their hope. And I think there's something, you know, quite important about that, particularly when you've got vast numbers of people in our society, it seems to me, who are rootless, who don't have that sort of great sort of sense of identity and whatever it might be. And actually, you know, telling the story can lead to much more creative and secure communities. And that's why, you know, we do still tell the story and we share the story with others.
I don't want your phone to be ringing off the hook, but if people do want to get in touch with you, Bishop Rob, or they want to know more about the work that your churches are doing in the community, how would you like people to do that?
So I have an email address, which is publicly available, so that's no problem. I can give that to you now. It's just bishop.edmonton@london.anglican.org. I have a public phone number, which is 02038375250. All is available.
You did that very quickly.
I'll do it again. 02038375250. So make sure everyone got that. And people can also, we can interact with each other on Twitter. So my Twitter feed is BP, that's short for Bishop, BP Edmonton. and we can interact on social media as well.
Okay, well, that's great. Well, thanks for doing it. It's really interesting. And, you know, we could have asked you a lot more questions, both on active social Christianity, which you're involved in, and also a philosophical background, which I find incredibly interesting. So, you know, thank you for doing it. And it's been really, really a great interview. And thank you, Emma, for, you know, taking part in it as well. And
I missed it for the world.
well,
you take care, won't you?
yeah, okay. And we'll end this interview now.